Taylor Morgan swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze drifting over the glittering ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung high above, casting warm light over New York's elite. Men in sharp tuxedos, women in designer gowns. They were all here to see and be seen, but Taylor was growing tired of the charade. He adjusted his cufflinks, suppressing a sigh. Being heir to the Morgan Empire meant always being in the spotlight, always performing, always pretending. "Why do you always look like you'd rather be anywhere but here?" A voice teased from beside him. Taylor turned, and his breath caught for a moment. Cassie Greenwood stood there, her soft green dress flowing effortlessly around her curves, her auburn hair loosely pinned with a few strands framing her face. She wasn't like the other women here, no calculated glances, no fake smiles, just honest warmth and a spark in her eyes. "Cassie," he greeted, his voice lower than intended. "I didn't expect to see you here." She smiled shyly. "A friend dragged me along. It's not really my scene." "Mine either," he admitted, surprising even himself. Her eyes softened. "I thought you'd be in your element, Mr. Billion-Dollar Heir." Taylor let out a small laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "It gets old." For a long moment, they just stood there, the chaotic noise of the gala fading as the connection between them sparked to life. He remembered all the other times they'd run into each other, through mutual friends, casual charity events, shared glances that lingered a second too long. But tonight felt different. "Want to get some air?" he asked suddenly, needing to escape. She hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." Outside on the balcony, the cool night air brushed against them. The city lights stretched endlessly in the distance, but Taylor couldn't stop glancing at Cassie. She was looking out over the city, her eyes thoughtful, her hands resting on the stone railing. "You always look like you're thinking about something far away," he said quietly. Cassie gave a small laugh. "Maybe I am." He turned to face her fully. "What is it?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm where I'm supposed to be, if I'm enough." The vulnerability in her voice shook something loose in Taylor's chest. He reached out, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You're more than enough, Cassie." Her eyes met his, wide and searching. "Taylor." But whatever she was going to say was lost as he leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, but when she responded, something inside both of them broke free. The kiss deepened, full of unspoken words and hidden longing. By the time they stumbled into Taylor's penthouse later that night, both knew they were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Clothes were shed in a flurry of emotion, their hands exploring, desperate to hold on to this one perfect night. For Taylor, it was everything he hadn't known he needed. For Cassie, it was a goodbye she couldn't speak out loud. The next morning, Taylor woke to an empty bed. The sheets still held her scent, but Cassie was gone. No note, no message, just silence. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, staring at the spot where she'd been. "Cassie?" He called out, but there was no answer. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She had left. And with her, she had taken a piece of his heart. Cassie stared out the tiny airplane window, watching the clouds drift by as the plane soared high above the Atlantic. Her fingers fidgeted nervously in her lap, twisting the delicate bracelet she always wore, a gift from her late mother. The city lights of New York had long disappeared beneath her, but her heart was still back there, tangled up in thoughts of Taylor. She closed her eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. Leaving him had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. Just hours ago, she had laid in his arms, feeling like she belonged for the first time in a long while. And yet, she had walked away. Her grandmother needed her, sick and frail with no one else to turn to. Cassie had convinced herself it was the right thing. But why did it feel like she had ripped her own heart out? When the plane finally touched down in France, the chill of reality settled in and life swept her away. The moment she arrived, she was swept into a whirlwind of responsibilities. Her grandmother's condition was worse than she'd been told. Cassie found herself at hospitals, doctors' offices, and managing the old estate that had fallen into disrepair. Days blended into nights. She would sit by her grandmother's bedside, holding her frail hand as the older woman drifted in and out of sleep. There was no time for Cassie to think about herself, and maybe that was easier, because every time she let herself pause, Taylor's face appeared in her mind. His touch, his laugh, his eyes searching hers in those quiet moments they had shared. She wanted to call him, to explain. But with every passing day it felt harder. Weeks turned into months, and Cassie learned how to silence the ache in her heart, even as it never truly left. Still at night, when the house was quiet and her grandmother was sleeping peacefully, Cassie would sit on the balcony under the French moonlight and wonder if Taylor ever thought of her the way she thought of him. If he hated her for leaving. If he had moved on. And with every unanswered question, her heart broke a little more. The sound of city traffic echoed through the tall glass windows of Taylor Morgan's office, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the tablet in front of him, but he hadn't read a word of the report his assistant had sent. It had been 8 months since Cassie left. 8 long months, and he still didn't know where she had gone. At first, he had thought she just needed a little time. A few days, maybe weeks. But when days stretched into months with no calls, no messages, and no trace of her, panic and frustration had taken root. He had tried everything, contacting mutual friends, calling her phone until it was disconnected. No one knew anything, and yet he couldn't let her go. "Mr. Morgan?" His assistant's voice broke into his thoughts. Taylor looked up, his expression sharp. "What is it?" She hesitated, balancing a tablet against her chest. "Your father is asking for an update on the Paris expansion. The board is expecting you to finalize the contract this week." Taylor rubbed his temples, leaning back in his chair. "Tell him I'll get to it." She lingered for a second longer, her eyes softening. "Sir, you've been working non-stop. Maybe take a break?" Taylor shook his head. "I'm fine. Just leave it on my desk." But as soon as she left, he exhaled, burying his face in his hands. He wasn't fine. Taking over more of Morgan Enterprises in the past year should have been a victory. He had secured billion-dollar deals, expanded into Europe, and turned failing ventures into profit. His father, James Morgan, was even starting to hand over more of the reins, something Taylor had waited for his entire life. But none of it felt like enough. None of it filled the hole Cassie had left behind. Every morning when he walked into the office, he could still hear her laugh, soft and genuine, from those days when they would hang out together. Every night, when he looked out at the city skyline from his penthouse, he wondered if she was seeing the same moonlight from somewhere far away. Where was she? He had even gone as far as hiring private investigators, but after a few months of searching, they had come back with nothing but dead ends. His father had noticed the shift in him. "You need to let this go," James Morgan had said one night over drinks. "She made her choice. You're the future of this company. You don't have time to chase after ghosts." But Taylor had only smiled bitterly. "She's not a ghost." Still, even as he built the company higher than ever, as he signed contracts and shook hands with some of the most powerful people in the world, Taylor couldn't stop wondering if she was okay. If she missed him. If she regretted leaving without a word. Sometimes he caught himself scrolling through old photos, blurry pictures from charity events, one of Cassie laughing at something stupid he had said, her hand brushing her hair back, that bright light in her eyes. Now, that light haunted him. One evening, as Taylor sat alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of whiskey, his phone buzzed. It was David, one of his closest friends, and now head of hospital relations for the Morgan Foundation. "You coming to the hospital fundraiser next month?" David asked. "Big gala. You're on the list as the top donor." Taylor ran a hand through his hair. "Maybe." "You should," David said meaningfully. "Might be good for you to get out of that office and actually talk to people." Taylor smirked, swirling the ice in his glass. "Since when do I need charity galas to talk to people?" David paused. "Look, I heard a rumor. Might be nothing, but..." Taylor sat up straighter. "What?" "I heard there's a new staff member at the hospital, a nurse. Someone mentioned her name, Cassie Greenwood." Taylor's heart stopped. She's back? His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken her name in months. I don't know for sure, David admitted, but if you show up to that fundraiser, you might find out. Taylor's pulse thundered in his ears. For months he had been searching, and now, without warning, she might be back in his city. Without another word, Taylor ended the call and set his glass down hard enough that it rattled. If she was back, if she was at that fundraiser, he would finally get the answers that had haunted him since the day she left. Cassie stepped off the plane onto U.S. soil, the familiar scent of jet fuel and city air filling her lungs. It felt surreal to be back. After nearly 2 years in France, she wasn't sure she would ever see New York again. The weight of grief still clung to her from losing her grandmother only a month ago. The woman who had raised her after her mother's passing, who had taught her to be strong, even when her heart was breaking. She gripped the handle of her suitcase tightly as she made her way through the airport, her stomach twisting with nerves. This was a fresh start, but it also meant facing everything she had left behind, including Taylor. Cassie hadn't let herself think about him too much in France. She had buried herself in caring for her grandmother, in learning to manage a life she hadn't expected. But in the quiet hours of the night, when her grandmother was asleep, Taylor's face would come to her. His soft smile, the way he had looked at her like she was his whole world. And the memory of leaving him behind without a word still filled her with guilt. New life, new chances, she whispered to herself as she pushed open the airport doors and stepped outside. Within a week, Cassie was already navigating the hospital hallways again, this time as official staff. The prestigious St. James Medical Center, one of the top hospitals in the country, had offered her a position as a senior nurse in their cardiology unit. The same hospital, she later learned, heavily funded by Morgan Enterprises. Her heart had nearly stopped when she read the foundation's name on the paperwork. Taylor. But she needed this job. She needed stability, purpose, and a place to start over. So she had pushed down the fear and signed the contract anyway. Now, as she walked through the bright white halls in her new scrubs, she forced herself to focus on her patients. Greenwood? A nurse called out from behind the station. Dr. Patel's asking for you in 302. Cassie smiled, grateful for something to keep her busy. On my way. The work was intense, but it was familiar. Helping people, giving them comfort, being there when they needed someone to care. It was what she was good at. But when she passed the large plaque in the hospital's atrium, reading Morgan Foundation, proud supporter of healthcare excellence, her steps always faltered. Do Taylor visit? Did he even think about her? The ache in her chest returned every time those thoughts crept in. Later that week, Cassie sat in the hospital break room, sipping lukewarm coffee, when her colleague Mia, the same friend who had helped her leave for France, plopped into the chair beside her. So, Mia said with a smirk, you're back and already back to running this place. Should have known. Cassie chuckled softly, trying to keep busy. Mia studied her for a long moment. You've seen the signs, right? You know whose money runs this place? Cassie's smile faltered. Yeah. Think he knows you're back? Cassie swallowed hard. I don't know. I'm not sure if I want him to. Mia leaned forward, lowering her voice. Cassie, you can't avoid him forever, especially since the hospital gala's coming up, and you're on the invite list, by the way. Hospital wants their top staff there. Cassie's eyes widened in panic. What? No, I'm not. Mia reached out and squeezed her hand. Look, maybe it's time. You've been running long enough. Maybe you need closure. Cassie let out a shaky breath. The idea of facing Taylor again, after everything, made her heart race. What would she even say? But deep down, she knew Mia was right. That night, as Cassie sat alone in her apartment, unpacked boxes still scattered around her, she stared out the window at the city lights. Memories of Taylor filled her. The way he had held her that night, like she was the only thing that mattered. The way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, as though he saw right through all her walls. She had left to protect her heart, and maybe his too. But now, back in his city, It felt like their story wasn't over. As she traced her finger along the rim of her coffee mug, Cassie realized she would have to face him eventually. Maybe at that fundraiser. Maybe sooner. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. But one thing was certain, she couldn't run forever. Cassie stared at her reflection in the mirror, smoothing down the soft fabric of her navy blue gown. It felt strange to be dressed up, so unlike her usual hospital scrubs and low-key jeans. The last time she'd worn anything like this had been... Her chest tightened. The night she had been with Taylor. She forced herself to look away from the mirror, grabbing her clutch and slipping on a pair of simple heels. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. The hospital's annual charity fundraiser gala was one of the biggest events of the year, a dazzling, over-the-top evening where millionaires and celebrities gathered to donate to hospital causes. As one of the senior nurses recently promoted to head of patient care initiatives, Cassie had been asked to attend and represent the hospital's nursing staff. She had tried to decline. Tried hard. But the administration wouldn't take no for an answer, and Mia had practically begged her to see it as a chance to breathe and be seen again. Still, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that stepping into that ballroom would change everything. Because if Taylor Morgan still supported this hospital, there was a very real chance he would be there. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her clutch. "Get it together, Cassie," she whispered to herself in the mirror. The grand ballroom was already filling when she arrived, chandeliers casting a golden glow across the polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp white uniforms passed around glasses of champagne and wine. The sound of soft jazz floated through the air, passe, and clusters of New York's elite chatted in corners, their laughter filling the space. Cassie felt out of place the moment she walked in, as though everyone could sense she didn't belong. She smiled politely at a few hospital board members, shaking hands, thanking donors, making small talk, but all the while her heart beat unevenly in her chest. She scanned the room, both hoping and dreading she might see him. Mia appeared at her side with a glass of champagne. "You made it," Mia said, a playful smile on her lips. Cassie took the glass gratefully. "I almost didn't." "You look amazing. Relax." Mia bumped her shoulder gently. "And if he's here?" Cassie shot her a look. "Don't." Mia held her hands up in surrender. "All right, but maybe tonight's the night to finally face the past." Cassie said nothing, taking a small sip of the drink to calm her nerves. As the speeches began, Cassie found herself tucked near one of the side tables, half listening as the hospital's directors thanked donors and praised medical breakthroughs funded by the Morgan Foundation. Her stomach twisted at the sound of the name. How could she possibly survive this night if she ran into him? Then she heard it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored tonight to be joined by the Morgan family, whose generous contributions have made so much of this possible. Please welcome Taylor Morgan." Cassie's hand froze around her glass. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned, and there he was. Taylor stood near the stage, tall and composed, his sharp black tuxedo fitting him like it was made for him, which it probably was. His dark hair was styled to perfection, and his face, just as handsome, just as devastating as she remembered, was calm, though his eyes carried a weight she recognized. Her heart pounded as she took in the sight of him, almost unable to breathe, and as if some invisible thread pulled him, he turned and saw her. For a long moment, time seemed to stop. Taylor's expression froze. His blue eyes locked on hers, and she could see the flash of shock, confusion, and something deeper, something raw and wounded, flicker across his face. Cassie's knees went weak, and she gripped the edge of the table behind her for support. Across the room, Taylor took a slow step forward, as if to confirm she was real, that she wasn't some cruel trick of his mind. Their eyes remained locked, and Cassie's pulse roared in her ears. She saw the way his jaw tightened, how his hands curled slightly at his sides, like he was fighting the urge to march over and demand answers. Part of her wanted to run. Part of her wanted to go to him, to explain everything, to say she was sorry. But she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from the man she had never stopped loving. As the applause for Taylor's speech filled the room, no one seemed to notice the electric tension pulsing between them. No one but them. And in that moment, Cassie knew. She could no longer hide, because Taylor had found her. Taylor's heart was thundering in his chest, louder than the polite applause echoing around him as the fundraiser host wrapped up the introductions. But he couldn't hear anything, not over the rush of emotions crashing down on him like waves. Cassie. She was here. She was real, not a dream, not a memory. Standing across the room in a navy blue gown that hugged her delicate frame, her chest rising and falling as if she was struggling to breathe too. For a long time, neither of them moved. Taylor's mind raced. Part of him wanted to push through the crowd, take her by the hand, and demand to know why she had left him, why she had disappeared and broken his heart without a word. Another part of him, the part that had spent years missing her, wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms and never let go. But Cassie looked frightened, as though she might bolt at any moment. The moment was interrupted when one of the board members clapped a hand on Taylor's shoulder, pulling his attention away for a brief second. But when Taylor looked back, Cassie had slipped into the crowd, disappearing before he could reach her. "Excuse me," Taylor muttered to no one in particular, ignoring the curious glances as he moved quickly through the crowd, scanning for her. But she was gone. Back in his penthouse, Taylor stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. His mind was spinning. She was back. Cassie was back. And she had looked at him like she was carrying the weight of the world, like the past 2 years had been just as hard for her as they had been for him. Why had she left? Why had she never reached out? Why was she back now, working in a hospital funded by his own company without ever telling him? A bitter laugh escaped his throat. Of all the places to reappear, Cassie. His fingers tightened around the glass. He needed answers. He couldn't let her walk away again. Not this time. Cassie sat in the small hospital cafe, her fingers trembling around her coffee cup. She had barely slept. After seeing Taylor last night, every nerve in her body felt raw. Part of her wanted to run again, but part of her knew she couldn't. As if on cue, her phone buzzed on the table. She flinched, her stomach tightening when she saw the name, Taylor Morgan. She stared at the screen, frozen. Finally, she picked up. "Cassie," his voice came, low and rough. She could hear the mix of anger, confusion, and pain in that single word. "Taylor," she whispered, her throat tight. "We need to talk." She swallowed. "I know." There was a long pause. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "My office. Noon. No more running." Her fingers curled tighter around the phone. "Okay." His voice was quieter now. "I'll see you then." He hung up before she could say anything else. Cassie let out a long, shaky breath and buried her face in her hands. Cassie stood outside the sleek glass doors of Morgan Enterprises, her palms sweating. People in sharp suits and heels walked in and out, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. She took a deep breath and forced her feet to move, stepping inside and taking the elevator up to the top floor. When she was led into Taylor's office, her heart nearly stopped at the sight of him. He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the skyline. But when he turned and saw her, his whole body tensed, like he was holding himself back from every emotion he wanted to throw at her. "Cassie," he said quietly, but his eyes were burning. She swallowed hard. "Taylor." The silence between them was so thick it was hard to breathe. Finally, Taylor spoke, his voice low but sharp like a blade coated in hurt. "Why?" She blinked, her throat tightening. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, stepping closer, anger and pain swirling in his gaze. "Why did you disappear without a word? You didn't even say goodbye. You just walked out of my life like I never meant anything to you." Cassie's eyes filled with tears. "That's not true." "Isn't it? You left?" His voice cracked, his calm facade slipping. "Because that's what it felt like, Cassie. One day you were there, in my arms, and the next day you were gone. I searched for you. For years, I searched." Her lip trembled. I didn't know what else to do. My grandmother, she was dying. She needed me, and I couldn't handle the thought of starting something with you and then having to leave. I thought if I walked away first, it would be easier for both of us. Taylor shook his head, pacing like a man trying to keep himself from shattering. You thought disappearing would make it easier? You thought not telling me anything was better than giving me the truth? Cassie, I would have followed you anywhere, but you didn't even give me the chance. Cassie wiped a tear from her cheek. I didn't want to be a burden to you. You had your family's empire, your life here, and I didn't know how to fit into that world. I was scared. Taylor stopped pacing and looked at her, his voice softening as pain overtook the anger. You didn't think I loved you enough to fight for you? Cassie's breath caught. I didn't know if you loved me. His eyes darkened with disbelief, stepping closer until he was right in front of her. I did, he whispered. I do. Cassie's eyes welled up again and her lips parted, but no words came out. I spent last 2 years loving you, Cassie, Taylor said, his voice breaking. 2 years wondering what I did wrong, why I wasn't enough for you to stay. Tears streamed down her face. You were enough, Taylor. You've always been enough. He reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek, his hand lingering there like he was afraid she'd vanish again. Why are you here now? He asked softly, searching her face. Why come back? Cassie placed her hand over his, holding it against her cheek. Because I couldn't stay away any longer, she whispered. Because I never stopped loving you either. Silence stretched between them as Taylor stared at her, his expression torn between hope and heartbreak. Finally, he whispered, Then don't run this time. Cassie took a deep breath, her hand tightening on his. I won't. The silence between them hung heavy, but neither made a move to let go. Taylor's hand still cupped Cassie's cheek, his thumb gently brushing away the last of her tears as though he was afraid she'd vanish if he stopped touching her. For a long time, they just stood there, eyes locked, neither knowing what to say next. Too much unsaid, too much buried under years of longing and heartbreak. Finally, Taylor broke the silence, his voice softer but still raw. Come with me. Cassie blinked, surprised. Where? He didn't answer right away, but instead, with a final searching look, took her hand and gently led her out of his office. His grip was firm but careful, as though she might shatter if he held on too tight. They walked through the corridors of Morgan Enterprises, past curious glances from employees who rarely saw Taylor Morgan with anyone, especially not a woman whose eyes carried the weight of shared history. Taylor led her to a private rooftop terrace, the same terrace where they had once talked late into the night during a company charity event, laughing, sharing secrets, both pretending not to notice how close they had been standing. The city stretched around them now, bathed in golden afternoon sunlight, but neither was looking at the view. Taylor turned to face her fully, letting out a slow breath. I've imagined this moment 100 times, he said, studying her. What I would say if I ever saw you again. Sometimes I thought I'd yell at you. Sometimes I thought I wouldn't say anything at all. Cassie swallowed, her throat tightening. Taylor. But now that you're here, he continued, cutting her off gently, all I can think about is how much I've missed you. Her eyes filled again, but she didn't look away. I have missed you too, she whispered. More than I can ever explain. He gave a broken laugh, running a hand through his hair. You don't have to explain it all now. I need to know if you're really here, if you're staying this time. Cassie stepped closer, her fingers reaching for his hand. I'm here, she said, her voice firmer, and I want to explain everything. I owe you that. Taylor's jaw tensed, but he nodded. All right, start from the beginning. Cassie took a deep breath, glancing away for a moment as she tried to find the right words. When I left, it wasn't because I didn't care. Taylor, you were the first person who ever made me feel like I wasn't alone, like I was seen, she began, her voice trembling. But when my grandmother called, when I found out she was sick, I was overwhelmed. She raised me. She was all I had left. I thought if I stayed, if I let myself fall for you, I'd break when I had to leave. So I ran. Taylor's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, listening intently, his eyes never leaving hers. I spent so many nights thinking about calling you, but I kept convincing myself that you deserved someone stronger, someone who didn't have so much baggage. Cassie continued, her voice breaking. I didn't know you were looking for me. I thought you would move on, that maybe I was just a moment in your life. Taylor's hand tightened on hers, his eyes dark and intense. You were never just a moment, Cassie. I tried to move on, but I couldn't. I couldn't get you out of my head or my heart. Every woman I met, it was like they weren't you. And when I finally accepted you were gone, it felt like I had lost something I was never going to get back. Cassie reached up, her fingers lightly brushing his cheek, her own eyes filled with sorrow. I'm so sorry, Taylor. I never wanted to hurt you. I was trying to protect you from all the chaos in my life, but I realize now I was only hurting us both. Taylor closed his eyes briefly, leaning into her touch before catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. I don't care about the chaos. I care about you, he murmured. Cassie felt tears spill over again, but this time there was a flicker of hope. I'm not the same person I was when I left, she whispered. But if you can give me a chance, I want to try. I want to see where this can go, if we can rebuild what we lost. Taylor's eyes searched, hers for a long moment before he nodded, emotion tightening his throat. I want that too, he said softly. Cassie, I've wanted that since the day you walked out that door. She gave him a watery smile. So, what now? Taylor smiled, a real, genuine smile that she hadn't seen in so long. Now? He said, stepping closer and wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her against him. Now we start over. No more running. No more secrets. Cassie let out a shaky laugh, resting her head against his chest, her heart pounding as his arms held her securely, like an anchor she hadn't realized she'd been craving for so long. I'd like that, she whispered. Taylor pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice soft but certain. We'll figure it out, Cassie. Together this time. And for the first time in years, as she stood there in his arms, Cassie believed it. Cassie stood in front of the mirror, smoothing that pale lavender dress Mia had convinced her to buy for something special. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined dinner with Taylor's parents, especially Margaret and Alan Morgan, New York's most prominent power couple. Her stomach churned with nerves. Taylor stepped into the room behind her, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes immediately softened when they landed on her. You look beautiful, he murmured, coming up behind her to gently rest his hands on her shoulders. Cassie smiled, though she couldn't hide the flicker of anxiety in her reflection. What if they don't like me? She whispered. Taylor leaned down to press a soft kiss to her temple. They'll love you. How could they not? But somewhere deep inside, Cassie wasn't so sure. Margaret greeted them at the grand entrance of the Morgan family estate, her smile gracious, her eyes sharp, assessing. Cassie, darling, so lovely to finally meet you, Margaret said smoothly, kissing her cheek as if they were lifelong friends. Alan followed, offering a warm handshake and a gentle, welcome, my dear. Taylor has told us so much about you. Cassie felt her nerves settle just a little under Alan's kind gaze, but something in Margaret's smile felt carefully measured, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Dinner was an elegant affair. Fine china, gleaming silverware, and dishes Cassie couldn't pronounce but managed to enjoy. Margaret asked polite questions, inquiring about Cassie's work at the hospital, her time in France, and her upbringing. So, you're a nurse? Margaret asked at one point, her tone even but curious. Cassie smiled, feeling Taylor's reassuring hand brush her knee under the table. Yes, I've always loved taking care of people. It's where I feel I make the most difference. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, her lips curving slightly. A very noble career. Alan jumped in to praise Cassie's dedication to her patients, and for a while, conversation flowed smoothly. By the time dessert was served, Cassie was starting to believe maybe, just maybe, things had gone well. As they left, Margaret embraced her warmly, and Alan offered another kind smile. Taylor's hand found hers as they walked to the car, his eyes bright with something close to pride. I told you it would go well, he whispered, lacing their fingers together. Cassie laughed softly, feeling a little lighter. Maybe you were right. But neither of them saw the calculating glint in Margaret's eyes as she watched them leave. Taylor was reviewing contracts in his office when his phone buzzed. He hesitated before answering. "Hey, Mom, everything all right?" Margaret's voice was calm, too calm. "Taylor, darling, I wanted to talk to you about last night." Taylor frowned. "What about it?" Margaret sighed delicately. "Cassie is sweet, very sweet, but I can't help but feel she's not quite the right match for you." His stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" "I just think someone like Doria Calloway would suit you better. You know Doria, her family, her background. She's from our world, Taylor. She would understand the life you live. Cassie, as lovely as she is, may not be ready for what comes with being part of the Morgan family." Taylor's jaw tensed. "I don't care about Doria, Mother. Cassie is who I want to be with." Margaret's voice softened, but her words stung. "Taylor, I'm only thinking about what's best for you. You need a woman who understands high expectations, someone with a certain status." Taylor's voice was sharp now. "Cassie has more strength and heart than anyone I know. Don't ever suggest she isn't good enough." "Think about it," Margaret said quietly before hanging up. Taylor sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, frustration boiling. Later that afternoon, Cassie was reviewing a patient chart at the nurse's station when Margaret Morgan, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, strode confidently into the ward. Cassie blinked, surprised, standing up straight. "Mrs. Morgan, is everything all right?" Margaret smiled smoothly. "Cassie, dear, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Can we talk?" Cassie's heart thudded uncomfortably, but she nodded, leading Margaret to a quiet corner. Margaret's smile remained, but her words cut like ice. "You're a lovely girl, Cassie, truly, and I can see Taylor cares for you deeply." Cassie's throat tightened. "Thank you." "But," Margaret continued, folding her hands neatly, "Taylor is destined for a very specific life, a life that requires a partner who can match him in every way, someone who can handle the pressure, the expectations. A doctor, for instance, would have been a perfect fit." Cassie swallowed hard, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "I'm not sure," Margaret said softly, "if you realize what you're stepping into. Taylor needs a woman who can stand beside him in every room, not just support him quietly, someone of equal standing." Cassie blinked back sudden tears, her heart pounding. "I'm sure you mean well, Mrs. Morgan," she said, her voice shaking, "but I care about Taylor. I'm not trying to be something I'm not." Margaret gave a soft, condescending smile. "I know you care for him, dear, but love isn't always enough." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Cassie frozen in place, feeling like her heart had been ripped open. That evening, Taylor opened his door to find Cassie standing there, her eyes filled with pain and doubt. "Cass, what's wrong?" he asked, immediately pulling her inside. She turned to face him, her hands shaking. "Did you know? Did you know your mother came to see me at the hospital today?" Taylor's expression darkened. "What? No. What did she say?" Cassie took a deep breath, tears welling. "She said I'm not enough for you, that if I were a doctor, I might have her approval. She said you need someone who matches you, someone from your world." Taylor cursed under his breath, raking a hand through his hair. "And the worst part," Cassie whispered, her voice breaking, "is that I've been thinking the same thing. Maybe I'm not enough. Maybe I'll never be enough." Taylor stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Don't you ever say that again," he said fiercely, his eyes burning with emotion. "You are everything I want. You hear me? Everything. I don't care what my mother thinks. I don't care what anyone thinks. You're enough, Cassie. You always have been." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned into his touch. "But what if I can't fit into your world?" she whispered. Taylor leaned closer, pressing his forehead against hers. "Then I'll leave that world behind if I have to. I'm not letting you go again." Cassie let out a sob, wrapping her arms around him as he held her tightly. "I love you," Taylor murmured, "just the way you are." Cassie clung to him, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. "I love you too," she whispered, finally allowing herself to believe it. A few days had passed since Cassie broke down in Taylor's arms, confessing her fears. Since then, Taylor had stayed close, proving in every small way that he meant what he said, that she was enough for him, no matter what his mother believed. But neither of them could have predicted what would happen next. Cassie was finishing her shift at the hospital when her phone rang, Taylor's name flashing on the screen. "Hey, sweetheart," she answered softly, smiling, until she heard his panicked voice. "Cassie, it's my dad." He collapsed. "We're on the way to the hospital now." Her heart stopped. "What? Taylor, how bad?" "I don't know. He was having chest pain." "Please, Cassie, you'll be there, right?" "I'm already here," she said, grabbing her badge and rushing toward the ER. "I'll take care of him. I promise." By the time Alan arrived, pale and sweating, Cassie was already in charge of the cardiac team, calmly issuing instructions, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Mr. Morgan, we've got you," she said gently, squeezing his hand as they wheeled him into a room. Alan managed a weak smile, gripping her hand tightly. "Knew you'd be here," he rasped, eyes closing as the doctors prepared to intervene. Cassie swallowed hard, blinking away tears. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. Through the long hours that followed, Cassie never left Alan's side. She coordinated his care, monitored every change in his condition, and personally checked in with the cardiology team. Even as the other nurses offered to take over, Cassie refused. "No, I've got him," she said firmly. Taylor stayed close when he could, watching Cassie work, seeing the fierce dedication in her every move. He had always known she was strong, but now seeing her fight for his father, he realized just how deep her heart ran. And Margaret saw it too. Margaret had arrived shortly after Alan was admitted, pale but composed. At first she kept her distance, watching Cassie with cool detachment. But as the hours passed and Cassie remained calm, competent, and caring, even gently comforting Margaret when Alan was moved to the ICU, something in Margaret's sharp gaze began to soften. By the third day, Alan was stable and resting quietly, his color returning. Cassie sat by his bedside, reviewing his latest test results when Margaret entered the room. For a moment, Margaret stood silently, watching Cassie carefully. "You've been here since the beginning," Margaret said quietly, her voice lacking its usual steel. Cassie looked up, surprised, but nodded. "I told Taylor I'd take care of him, and I meant it." Margaret swallowed, stepping closer, her hands wringing slightly, a rare sign of vulnerability in a woman always so composed. "I wasn't sure about you," Margaret admitted, her voice softer than Cassie had ever heard. "I thought you wouldn't understand our world, what it means to be part of this family. I was wrong." Cassie blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "I saw the way you never left his side, how you put him and us above everything else," Margaret continued, her eyes damp. "And I realize now that status doesn't matter. What you've done for Alan, for my family, it's more than I could ever ask from anyone." Cassie felt tears prick her eyes, but kept her voice steady. "I love Taylor. I love his family too. Whether you think I belong here or not, I would never let him face this alone." Margaret's lips trembled before she finally reached out, her hand gently covering Cassie's. "Thank you, Cassie," she whispered, "for saving him, for staying when I didn't believe in you." Cassie's breath caught in her throat, seeing Margaret, the formidable, elegant woman, offering something like an apology. Margaret took a shaky breath. "I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry." Cassie smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "Alan means a lot to me, and so does Taylor. I'm not going anywhere." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. "I can see that now." After finishing her shift and checking on Alan one last time, Cassie finally slipped into Taylor's arms in the hospital's quiet rooftop garden. He kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "My mom told me she apologized," Taylor murmured, pulling back to look into her eyes. "She told me you never left my dad's side." Cassie let out a soft laugh, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I couldn't leave. He needed someone he knew." Taylor cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin. "You're incredible, you know that?" She smiled, her eyes softening. "I just did what anyone who cares would do." Taylor shook his head, his gaze intense but full of love. "No, Cass, you went above and beyond. You've shown my mom and me exactly who you are." Cassie looked up at him, her voice quieter now. "You really think I can handle being part of your world, Taylor?" He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. "I don't care about that world," he whispered against her mouth. "I care about you. And after this, there's no one else I'd ever want by my side." Cassie smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "Good," she whispered, resting her forehead against his. "Because I'm not going anywhere. and for the first time, both of them believed it. Alan Morgan sat propped up in his hospital bed, color fully returned to his cheeks, a glass of water in hand as he quietly read the paper. The strong, commanding figure of the Morgan family looked tired but alive and recovering fast. Cassie smiled softly as she entered the room, her clipboard tucked against her side. "Mr. Morgan," she said warmly, "if you keep improving like this, we're going to have to kick you out soon." Alan looked up over his reading glasses, a twinkle of humor in his eyes. "Cassie, dear, I think you've enjoyed bossing me around a little too much," she laughed, moving to check his vitals. "Maybe a little, but I'm just glad to see you doing so well." Alan studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "You never left, did you?" he asked quietly. Cassie paused, glancing up at him. "No, sir, I told Taylor I wouldn't." Alan nodded, his voice thoughtful. "You kept this old man alive, and you kept my son steady." Cassie blushed, brushing her hair behind her ear. "I just did my job." Alan shook his head gently. "No, Cassie, you did a lot more than that." Later that afternoon, as Cassie was gathering her things to finish her shift, Alan waved her over again, this time with a more serious expression. "Sit with me for a moment, Cassie," he said, patting the chair beside his bed. Cassie hesitated but sat down, curious and a little nervous. Alan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking a lot since this scare," he began. "About life, about family, about the people who matter." Cassie listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I will not lie to you," Alan said, glancing at her. "When Taylor first mentioned you, I didn't know what to think. You were this mystery, and my wife," he sighed. "Margaret had her reservations. But now, after what I've seen, after you took care of me without a second thought, I see it clearly." He reached over and gently took her hand. "You love him." Cassie's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I do. I have for a long time now." Alan smiled, his grip tightening just a little. "And he loves you, Mr. Morgan. I saw it in his eyes when he sat beside me, refusing to leave, waiting for you to tell him it would all be okay." Cassie blinked quickly to keep from crying, swallowing the lump in her throat. Alan continued, his tone warming. "Cassie, I want to offer you something. I've watched you care for patients, watched you hold this family together, and I think you could do more, be more." Cassie frowned slightly. "Curious. What do you mean?" Alan sat back. "I want to offer you a position at the Morgan Foundation. We need someone with your heart, your compassion, someone who understands both the medical side and what patients and families truly need. I want you to help lead some of our healthcare initiatives. You'd work directly with us, shaping projects and helping people on a larger scale." Cassie was speechless, her eyes wide. "Mr. Morgan, that's—" "Call me Alan." He interrupted with a smile. "Alan," she said softly, still overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "I say yes," he said gently. "You belong with us, Cassie, in every way." Her eyes filled again, but this time, would be honored. Later that evening, Taylor arrived to check on his father, and Alan sent Margaret out to grab him something decent to eat. Once they were alone, Alan gestured for Taylor to sit beside him. Taylor raised an eyebrow, but sat down. "You're looking a lot better." Alan smiled, "Thanks to Cassie." Taylor's expression softened at the mention of her name. Alan looked at him seriously. "Taylor, I want you to know something. I gave her a position with the foundation today. She deserves it, and I trust her with it." Taylor blinked in surprise. "You did?" "Yes," Alan said firmly, "and I'm telling you this now because I want you to understand something." He leaned in slightly. "Cassie is the best thing that's ever happened to you. I was blind not to see it sooner, and if you're smart, you'll hold on to her and never let her go." Taylor's throat tightened. "You really mean that?" Alan smiled softly. "I do. You have my blessing, son. For her, for all of it." Taylor let out a slow breath, feeling something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was holding. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. "That means everything." Taylor found Cassie on her apartment balcony, staring out over the city, lost in thought. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. She smiled, leaning back against him. "Hey," she murmured. "Hey," he whispered into her hair. He kissed her temple, then leaned back just enough to look at her. "Dad told me everything." Cassie turned, her brows raising slightly. About offering you a role at the foundation, about giving us his blessing." Cassie's eyes widened, softening with emotion. He did? Taylor smiled, tucking her hair behind her ear. Yeah, he told me I'd be a fool to ever let you go. Cassie let out a soft laugh, her eyes glimmering. Smart man? Very smart, Taylor agreed, leaning in to kiss her, slow and tender. When he pulled back, he cupped her face in his hands. Cassie, I know this hasn't been easy, but I'm all in. You, me, this life, whatever comes next, we're facing it together. Cassie placed her hands over his. I'm all in too, Taylor. As they stood on the balcony, holding each other close, the city lights sparkling around them, neither of them had any doubt this was the beginning of something real. Something lasting. And for the first time, the future felt wide open, and theirs to claim. The warm spring sun poured through the grand windows of the Morgan estate, casting golden light across the polished wood floors. It was Alan's first day home from the hospital, and everyone was gathered to celebrate his recovery. Cassie stood in the kitchen, arranging a vase of flowers, simple, bright ones she knew Alan would like. She still felt a mixture of awe and humility being here, among Taylor's family, but Alan's recent blessing had made her feel accepted in a way she hadn't thought possible. Taylor walked in behind her, slipping his arms around her waist and pressing a soft kiss to her cheek. You okay? He murmured, sensing her nerves. She smiled and nodded. I'm okay. Just happy to see your dad back home. Taylor grinned. Me too. And for the record, you're not a guest here anymore, Cass. You're family. Cassie's heart fluttered, leaning back into him. Thank you for reminding me. In the living room, Alan was seated comfortably on a couch, looking healthier than anyone had expected so soon. Margaret sat nearby, surprisingly calm and gracious, though occasionally watching Cassie and Taylor with a quiet, thoughtful gaze. Mia had even stopped by to visit, joining them for a casual lunch to mark the occasion. Alan laughed as Cassie handed him tea. If you keep spoiling me like this, Cassie, I might never let you go. Cassie chuckled, sitting beside Taylor, who slid an arm around her shoulders. You've earned a little spoiling, Alan. Margaret smiled, nodding. She's right. Taylor glanced at his mother, surprised and pleased by her gentle tone. For the first time in a long while, everything felt right. Until the doorbell rang. The butler appeared moments later, stepping cautiously into the room. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, there's a Miss Doria Calloway here to see you. Cassie felt Taylor stiffen beside her, his arm instinctively tightening around her. Margaret's brow furrowed. Doria? I didn't invite her. Alan sat forward slightly confused. Before anyone could answer, Doria swept into the room, smiling brightly like she owned the place. Her blonde hair perfectly styled, dressed in a pale pink designer dress that screamed elegance and wealth. Margaret, Alan, you look well, she said sweetly, gliding over to kiss Margaret's cheek, as though she hadn't noticed the tension filling the room. Doria, Margaret said, her tone polite but stiff, we weren't expecting you. Doria laughed lightly. Oh well, I just thought since Alan is home I'd stop by. You know my father has been so concerned and sends his best. Her eyes flicked to Cassie, sitting so close to Taylor, and something cold and sharp flickered in her gaze before she masked it with another smile. And Taylor, she purred, walking over and placing a hand on his shoulder, lingering too long. You look well. It's been too long. Taylor gently removed her hand, his expression hardening as he stood and moved to stand behind Cassie, resting his hands protectively on her shoulders. It's been a long time, Doria, he said flatly. Cassie sat frozen, swallowing as Doria's gaze flicked between them. Oh, Doria said, her smile faltering slightly. I didn't realize you had company. Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt, her eyes sharp. Cassie is not company, she's family. Cassie's heart stuttered, glancing up in surprise. Doria blinked, momentarily thrown off, but recovered quickly. Of course, she said with a small, insincere smile. Of course. Later, after Doria had left with promises to stop by again soon, Taylor pulled his mother aside, tension radiating off him. Why did you invite her, Mother? He demanded, his voice low but filled with frustration. Margaret's eyes widened. I didn't, Taylor. I had no idea she was coming. Taylor stared at her, skeptical. Really? Because it sure looked like she thought she belonged here. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. I wouldn't do that to you, or to Cassie. Taylor's shoulders relaxed slightly, but he still looked wary. Then why would she show up like that? Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. I think her father is behind it. Taylor frowned. What do you mean? Margaret looked genuinely tired as she explained. Ever since you and Doria were seen together at those events years ago, her father has been eager to form an alliance between our families. He wanted you two to marry, to unite the Calloway and Morgan names. I wouldn't be surprised if he sent her here today, hoping to rekindle that idea. Taylor swore under his breath. Well, that's not happening. Not now, not ever. Margaret touched his arm, her voice softer. I believe you, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry, Taylor. I see how much Cassie means to you now. I won't let anyone, including Doria, come between you two. Taylor nodded, though his jaw was still tight. Thank you, Mother. Later that night, Taylor found Cassie in the library, curled up on the couch with a book she hadn't really been reading. He sat beside her, reaching for her hand. I'm sorry about today, he said quietly. I didn't know she was coming. Cassie gave him a soft smile, squeezing his hand. I know, it just caught me off guard. He cupped her face gently, making her meet his gaze. Don't let her get into your head, Cass. She doesn't matter. You do. You always will. Cassie leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. Thank you for standing up for me. For us. Taylor smiled, leaning in to kiss her softly. Always. As they sat there in the quiet, Cassie felt a deep sense of peace. Even though Doria had tried to stir up the past, it was clear where Taylor's heart was, and it was with her. Cassie leaned against him, finally letting herself believe in this future, their future, without fear. Spring had fully arrived, and New York was alive with color. Bright blooms lining the parks, soft breezes warming the city streets. But Taylor wasn't thinking about the city today. All he could think about was her. It had been weeks since Alan came home and since Doria's surprise visit had tested their peace. But things had only grown stronger between Taylor and Cassie. They were more connected, closer, more certain than ever that they belonged together. Now, Taylor was ready to take the next step. He smiled to himself as he glanced down at the small velvet box resting in his pocket. Inside was the ring. A stunning, elegant diamond surrounded by a delicate halo, simple and timeless, just like Cassie. Tonight was the night. Cassie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the soft blush-colored dress Taylor had sent over earlier that day with a sweet note. Dinner. Just us. Trust me. Tea. Her heart had raced when she read it. Something about his tone felt different, like something big was about to happen. When Taylor arrived to pick her up, he looked devastatingly handsome in a dark suit, no tie, collar open, perfectly blending casual and formal. But it was his eyes, soft and full of love, that made her breath catch. You look. He paused, taking her in. Absolutely beautiful. Cassie smiled shyly. Thank you. You don't look so bad yourself, he grinned, offering his hand. Come with me? She took it without hesitation. Always. Instead of a restaurant, Taylor led Cassie to a rooftop, but not just any rooftop. It was his private terrace at Morgan Enterprises, the place where so long ago they had shared late-night talks and where, more recently, they had finally reunited. Cassie gasped as they stepped out. The space had been transformed. Strings of soft golden lights were strung overhead, casting a gentle glow. A small table was set for two, complete with candles and flowers. Off to the side, a musician quietly played a soft tune on a violin. Cassie turned to him, tears already filling her eyes. Taylor, this is beautiful. He smiled, holding her hand. I wanted it to be perfect. You deserve that. As they sat down to dinner, Taylor was attentive, but Cassie could sense his nerves, though he kept trying to act casual. They laughed, talked, reminisced about old moments, but she noticed the way his fingers sometimes fidgeted with the napkin, or how he kept glancing at her like he had something to say. After dinner, as the sky deepened to dusk and the city lights glittered around them, Taylor stood and walked around to where Cassie sat. Cass, he began softly, reaching out a hand to pull her to her feet. I've been trying to figure out the right words to say this, but the truth is, I've known how I felt about you for a long time. Cassie's breath caught, her heart pounding as she looked up at him. Taylor took both her hands in his, eyes locked on hers. I thought when you left that I had lost my chance. But you came back, and when you did, I realized I never want to lose you again. Ever. Tears filled her eyes as she smiled softly. You've changed my life, Cassie. You've taught me what it means to love someone. Completely. and I know now that nothing else matters if I don't have you by my side." He reached into his pocket, and Cassie's hand flew to her mouth when he dropped to one knee, holding out the velvet box and opening it to reveal the stunning ring that sparkled under the lights. "Cassie Greenwood," Taylor said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Will you marry me? Will you make me the luckiest man in the world and let me love you for the rest of my life?" Cassie's tears fell freely now, but her smile was radiant as she nodded quickly, unable to speak for a moment. "Yes," she finally whispered, then louder, laughing through her tears. "Yes, yes, Taylor, I'll marry you." Taylor's face broke into a wide, relieved smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he stood, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her into a deep, emotional kiss as she held on to him tightly. The violinist softly transitioned to a romantic tune as they stood there, wrapped in each other. Later, they sat on the couch under the lights, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. "I didn't think I could be this happy," Cassie whispered, gazing at the ring on her finger, then up at him. Taylor kissed her forehead. "Me neither." "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked softly, her old insecurities flickering for a moment. Taylor cupped her cheek, making her meet his gaze. "This is all I've ever wanted, Cassie. You, us, a life together." She smiled, resting her hand on his chest where his heart beat steadily. "I love you so much," she whispered. "I love you more," he whispered back. And as they sat there watching the city lights, Cassie knew that no matter what storms might come, they would face them together, forever. The morning sun poured gently over the Morgan estate, casting a warm glow over the manicured gardens that had been transformed into an elegant dreamscape for Cassie and Taylor's wedding. Soft white roses and pale blush peonies were arranged in sweeping arches, mingling with greenery that framed the ceremony space. Rows of white chairs with satin ribbons faced a stunning altar set against a backdrop of trees and sparkling lights woven among the branches. Everything was perfect, just like Taylor had promised Cassie it would be. Cassie stood in front of the mirror in a quiet room inside the estate, her heart pounding as she smoothed down the delicate lace of her wedding dress. The gown was elegant, simple, with intricate beading along the bodice and a flowing skirt that made her feel like she had stepped out of a dream. Mia stood behind her, wiping away a tear as she adjusted Cassie's veil. "You're really doing this," Mia whispered, smiling. "You're marrying Taylor Morgan." Cassie let out a soft laugh, though her throat was tight with emotion. "I can't believe it's real," she whispered, staring at her reflection. "You deserve all of this," Mia said firmly. "You fought so hard to get here. And he loves you so much, Cassie. We all see it." Cassie blinked back tears as she turned to her friend. "I love him too, more than anything." Mia grinned. "Then let's get you down that aisle." Meanwhile, Taylor stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, adjusting his cufflinks as Alan approached. "Son," Alan said, clapping a hand on Taylor's shoulder, "you look nervous." Taylor laughed under his breath. "I'm not nervous about marrying her. I'm nervous because I want today to be perfect for her. After everything, she deserves perfect." Alan smiled, proud. "You've already given her what she needs, Taylor. Your heart, and from where I'm standing, that's enough." Taylor glanced down at the ring in his hand, simple, yet timeless, a match to the engagement ring Cassie had worn every day since he proposed. "You think Mom's okay?" Taylor asked quietly, still wary after the Doria incident. Alan chuckled. "Your mother has come around, son. You saw how she's been these past few months. Trust me, she wants this now as much as you do." Taylor exhaled slowly, smiling as he looked out over the sea of chairs where guests were beginning to gather. "I'm ready," he said firmly. As the music began to play, Taylor stood waiting at the altar, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, looking every bit the powerful, confident man, but with love written all over his face. Margaret sat beside Alan, her expression softer than anyone had ever seen, her hands folded over her heart as she waited to see the woman who had captured her son's soul. When Cassie finally appeared at the top of the aisle, escorted by Mia, everything stopped. The guests, the breeze, even Taylor's breath, all frozen as he took in the sight of her. She looked breathtaking, her eyes only for him as she walked slowly, her smile radiant but filled with tears. Taylor swallowed hard, blinking rapidly to keep from crying himself. As she reached him, he gently took her hands in his, leaning close to whisper, "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Cassie's lips trembled as she smiled up at him. "And you're the only man I'll ever love." When the officiant asked them to share their vows, Taylor went first, holding her hands tightly, speaking from his soul. "Before you, Cassie, I didn't know what real love looked like. You've shown me strength, kindness, and grace. You've taught me how to love and how to fight for love. And today I promise to always choose you, to stand by you in every storm and in every sunrise. I will love you for the rest of my life, and longer, if I can." Tears streamed down Cassie's face as she smiled, her heart full. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Taylor, you've been my safe place, my partner, and my best friend. You saw me when I was lost, and you loved me even when I couldn't love myself. You showed me that home isn't a place, it's a person. It's you. I promise to love you with everything I am, to support your dreams, and to build a life with you filled with laughter, kindness, and love." By the time she finished, even Margaret dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Taylor pulled Cassie close, cupping her face as he kissed her deeply, to the sound of cheering and clapping around them. When they broke apart, Cassie laughed softly, her eyes glowing. "You're mine now, Mr. Morgan," she teased. Taylor grinned, holding her close. "And you're mine, Mrs. Morgan." The reception was a beautiful, joyful celebration. Laughter, dancing, and toasts filled the night. Margaret, to everyone's surprise, stood and made a toast of her own. "I'll admit, I didn't always see what my son saw. But today, watching Cassie care for Alan, watching the way she loves Taylor, I see it clearly now. Cassie, welcome to our family. You are and always will be part of us." Cassie smiled, tears in her eyes, as Taylor took her hand under the table and squeezed it. Alan smiled warmly from beside Margaret, his arm around her shoulders. And as Taylor and Cassie shared their first dance under the twinkle of fairy lights, surrounded by family and friends, it felt like the perfect ending to one chapter, and the beautiful beginning of the next. Their story, full of love, pain, healing, and hope, had brought them here. And now, they would write the rest together. 4 months later, the warmth of summer had settled over New York, and life was moving beautifully for Taylor and Cassie Morgan. Cassie was working closely with Margaret on the Morgan Foundation's new healthcare outreach project, focusing on programs that supported struggling families with medical needs, a cause close to her heart. It had been a peaceful, happy few months of marriage, until today. Cassie sat across from Margaret at a quiet, upscale cafe, gently stirring her tea. She felt a little off, but tried to ignore it. "You've done wonderful work on the family care program," Margaret said genuinely, giving Cassie a rare and warm smile. "I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish, thanks to you." Cassie smiled but reached for her water, feeling a wave of dizziness. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm really proud of it too," Cassie said, but there was a pale look in her cheeks that Margaret didn't miss. Margaret narrowed her eyes slightly, tilting her head as she studied Cassie carefully. "Are you all right, dear? You look a little pale." Cassie waved her hand, giving a soft laugh. "I'm fine, really. Probably just didn't eat enough this morning." But Margaret didn't seem convinced. As they finished lunch and parted ways, Margaret gave her a long look before hugging her tightly. "You let me know if you need anything," she said quietly. Cassie smiled and nodded, but inside her mind was already racing. Back at home, Margaret walked straight into Alan's office, not even bothering to knock. Alan glanced up from his paperwork, raising an eyebrow. "Margaret, something wrong?" She sat down with a determined sigh. "I think Cassie's pregnant." Alan blinked in surprise, then chuckled. "What makes you say that?" Margaret folded her arms. "I know the signs, Alan. She was pale, looked like she was fighting to stay upright, and when I asked if she was okay, she brushed it off. But a mother knows." Alan leaned back, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well, maybe, but don't start picking out cribs yet. We don't know for sure." Margaret huffed, but her eyes twinkled with excitement. "We'll see. You mark my words, Alan. I'm going to be a grandmother." Alan laughed, shaking his head. "Let's just wait and let them tell us when they're ready." Margaret, however, was already mentally planning baby showers. That night, Cassie sat nervously on the examination table, fidgeting with the edge of her shirt as the doctor came back in, holding a file. Mrs. Morgan, the doctor said kindly, sitting down across from her. Congratulations, you're about 6 weeks pregnant. Cassie's heart stopped and then exploded with joy and nerves all at once. A baby? She whispered, tears springing to her eyes. The doctor smiled warmly. Yes, everything looks healthy so far. Cassie thanked her and left the office, her heart racing. Later that evening, Cassie paced in their apartment, holding the small sonogram picture in her hand. When Taylor walked in from work, loosening his tie, he immediately sensed something different. Hey, beautiful, he greeted, walking over to kiss her cheek. What's going on? You look like you're about to burst. Cassie laughed nervously, her hands trembling as she held out the sonogram picture. Taylor took it, confused for a moment, until realization dawned. His eyes went wide. Is this, Cassie, are you? She nodded quickly, tears spilling over. You're going to be a daddy. Taylor let out a breathless laugh, grabbing her and spinning her around before pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly. Oh my God, he whispered into her hair. Cass, we're having a baby? Yes, she laughed, crying and smiling all at once. We're having a baby. Taylor cupped her face, pressing kiss after kiss to her lips, her cheeks, her forehead. I love you so much, he whispered. Cassie beamed up at him. I love you too. The next evening, Alan and Margaret were hosting a family dinner, something casual but intimate, until Taylor and Cassie showed up with secret smiles. As they sat around the table, enjoying dessert, Taylor reached for Cassie's hand under the table and gave her a subtle nod. Margaret watched them like a hawk, her suspicion already rising. Finally, Taylor stood up, holding his glass. Mom, Dad, we actually have some news. Margaret sat up straighter. News? Cassie blushed, glancing at Taylor. We wanted to wait until we were sure, Cassie said softly. But we're having a baby. Margaret's jaw dropped, and then she let out a small, delighted gasp. I knew it, she cried, standing and rushing over to hug Cassie tightly. Oh, darling, I knew it. I'm so happy for you both. Cassie laughed through tears as Margaret kissed her cheek. Alan stood, beaming as he shook Taylor's hand and then pulled him into a hug. Congratulations, son. You're going to be a great father. Taylor smiled, overcome with emotion. Thanks, Dad. Margaret clapped her hands together, already thinking ahead. We'll have to start getting the nursery ready, and of course a proper baby shower, and… Alan chuckled. Let them breathe, Margaret. Cassie and Taylor exchanged a look filled with love, excitement, and a little nervousness, knowing their lives were about to change forever. In the best way. As Taylor pulled Cassie close, kissing her temple, he whispered, Our family is just beginning. And Cassie smiled, resting her hand over her belly, knowing he was right. Cassie lay back on the examination table, her hand tightly gripping Taylor's, as the doctor moved the ultrasound wand across her belly. The room was quiet, until suddenly a steady heartbeat filled the air. Fast, strong, and beautiful. Cassie's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Taylor. His jaw was clenched, but his eyes were wide, shining with emotion, as he stared at the screen. That's our baby, he whispered in awe, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Cassie let out a soft laugh, wiping her tears. Yeah, our baby. Later that night, Taylor couldn't stop watching Cassie as she sat in their living room, cradling her belly even though it was barely showing. Stop looking at me like that, she teased gently. Taylor grinned, walking over and kneeling in front of her, resting his hands carefully on her stomach. I just can't believe I get to love both of you. Cassie smiled, running her fingers through his hair. You're going to be an amazing dad, you know that? Taylor pressed a kiss to her stomach, whispering, You're going to be the best mom. As their baby kicked for the first time that night, they both laughed and cried, knowing this was only the beginning of a beautiful life together. The next morning, Cassie stood in front of the nursery room, her hands resting gently on her growing belly. The space was still empty. Bare walls, no crib, no rocking chair, but she could already imagine their baby there, sleeping peacefully. Taylor came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. What are you thinking about? He asked softly. She smiled, leaning into him. How much our life is about to change. He kissed her cheek. In the best way. Cassie chuckled as she turned in his arms. Speaking of change, we need to start getting this room ready. You know, a crib, changing table, the works. Taylor grinned. I already ordered the crib yesterday. Her eyes widened. You did? He nodded, smirking. Of course, I want everything perfect for you and the baby. Cassie shook her head, laughing. What am I going to do with you? Love me forever, he teased, pulling her close. She smiled, her eyes softening. Always. As they stood there wrapped in each other's arms, Cassie felt their baby kick softly again, and she gasped, grabbing Taylor's hand to place it on her belly. There, she whispered. Taylor's eyes widened in awe. That's our baby. Cassie gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her breathing coming in quick, shallow bursts. Taylor, she called out, her voice wavering. Taylor came rushing in from the other room, his phone in one hand, looking instantly panicked when he saw her leaning over, a hand pressed to her belly. Cass, what is it? What's wrong? He was by her side in seconds, supporting her as another sharp contraction hit, leaving her breathless. I think it's time, she gasped out, clutching at his hand. Taylor's eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. Okay, we've got this. Trying to stay calm for her, he helped her to sit down carefully. Let me get the bag. I'll call the car. We're going to the hospital right now. Cassie smiled through the pain, her eyes full of tears. Taylor, we're having our baby today. Taylor kissed her forehead, whispering, Yeah, baby, we are, and I'm right here. By the time they got to the hospital, Cassie was already deep in labor. Taylor held her hand through every contraction, never leaving her side. You're doing so good, Cass, he whispered, brushing her sweaty hair from her face as she groaned through another wave of pain. She gripped his hand tighter, her voice shaking. I can't do this, Taylor. It's too much. His heart broke seeing her in pain, but he kissed her forehead, a voice steady. Yes, you can. You are the strongest woman I know. You've got this, and I've got you. Cassie let out a weak laugh. You better. Hours passed, the pain growing, but Taylor never let go, whispering encouragement, kissing her temple, holding her close between contractions. Outside, Margaret and Alan waited anxiously in the family room, pacing and whispering, hoping for news. Margaret clutched Alan's hand tightly, her tough exterior softening as she quietly prayed for her daughter-in-law and grandchild. Finally, when the time came to push, Taylor stood beside Cassie, holding her hand as she bore down with everything she had. You're almost there, baby. You can do this, he murmured, his voice cracking as he watched her fight through the pain. And then, a cry filled the room. Cassie gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks as the doctor lifted their tiny, wriggling baby, the loudest, most beautiful sound they had ever heard. Taylor let out a shaky breath, his eyes filling with tears. It's a girl, the doctor announced, smiling as she handed the baby to Cassie. Cassie stared at the tiny pink bundle placed on her chest, her whole body trembling with emotion. Hi, sweetheart, she whispered, sobbing softly. Taylor sat beside her, wrapping his arms around both of them, tears streaming down his face as he kissed Cassie's temple. You did it, he whispered. You brought her here. Cassie looked up at him, her eyes shining. We did. Taylor gently cupped the baby's tiny head, whispering in awe. She's perfect. A while later, after they had held their daughter and whispered to her, a nurse brought Margaret and Alan in. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes instantly filling with tears. Oh, Cassie, Taylor, she whispered, approaching slowly. Meet your granddaughter, Taylor said softly, pride and love radiating from him. Margaret gently leaned over to see the baby, her face softening completely. She's beautiful, Alan beamed, resting a hand on Taylor's shoulder. You did good, son. Both of you. Cassie smiled tiredly. Want to hold her? She asked, looking at Margaret. Margaret looked stunned but nodded eagerly. As she held the tiny baby in her arms, tears rolled down her cheeks. Welcome to the family, little one. Taylor wrapped his arm around Cassie as they watched their daughter in Margaret's arms, feeling like everything had finally come full circle. Later, when the room was quiet and family had left, Taylor climbed into bed beside Cassie, wrapping his arms around her and the baby. What are you thinking? Cassie asked softly, glancing up at him. Taylor kissed the top of her head, gazing at their daughter. I'm thinking, I never knew I could love this much, he whispered. Cassie leaned into him, smiling. Me too. Taylor reached down, brushing a finger gently over the baby's tiny hand. We're a family now. Cassie's eyes filled with tears, happy tears. Yeah, we are. As their baby yawned and snuggled closer to Cassie's chest, Taylor wrapped them both tightly in his arms, vowing silently to protect and love them forever. And in that quiet, perfect moment, Cassie knew that no matter how their story began, this was the happiest chapter of all. Hope you enjoyed listening to Green Tea Tales. Help our channel grow with like, share, comments, and subscribe.